Hi, my name is Gray Himmelman, and today I'm going to be talking about my capstone, Saving Rural America. Before I talk about all the problems in rural areas, I'd like to preface this by saying I really enjoyed my time growing up in rural America in Fayette, which technically isn't a rural area. To be considered a rural area by the federal government, you have to have a population of 2,500 or less. But Howard County is a rural county, and this to me is basically a rural area. And rural areas have many benefits. They're cost efficient, calm, clean, safe, and everybody knows you, and you know everybody, and it's a really comfortable area to live in. And I wouldn't change where I grew up at all. But rural America on a larger scale is struggling. Rural Americans are leaving rural areas for suburban and urban areas. And the people leaving are really hurting rural areas. And why are Americans leaving rural areas? Well, education in rural areas is poorer than those in suburban and urban areas. Access to healthcare in rural areas is also poor. The economic opportunity in suburban and urban areas is better, and there are other factors. So how do we get people to come back to rural areas is the key question I'm trying to answer. And I believe that the three branches of government, the federal, state, and local government, they need to work together to come up with a plan to save and revitalize rural America. So first, I'm going to talk about some of the problems facing rural America. And one of those is education. Rural districts really struggle in education in two parts, and one of those is teacher attraction. Because at rural school districts, teachers face low salaries, which at urban and suburban areas, the salaries are going to be higher. And geographic isolation, you're far away from bigger areas in some of these rural areas. And also underfunding. Many federal and state funding systems favor schools with higher student populations, so rural districts are kind of they're not getting the good end of the stick in funding. Rural areas are also struggling in economic opportunity. Many careers are simply just unavailable or not in demand in rural areas. And farm employment has also been a big thing. So in the 1900s, rural America's cornerstone occupation was farming. And farm employment has dropped by 90% since the 1900s to the 2000s. Based on all this technology we've developed, we don't need as many people working on the farms to get the output that we need. So obviously, if farm employment's dropping, we're going to need another field to kind of boost up and employ rural Americans. But this hasn't really happened. Job creation since the Great Recession, it's occurred mostly in metropolitan areas. There hasn't been much growth in rural areas, according to studies. And so this obviously has led to high rates of unemployment, high rates of poverty. Rural poverty rates have been higher than urban areas since the 1960s, and based on recent data in 2017, the rural poverty rate was 3.5% higher than the urban poverty rate. Health and healthcare are also poor in rural areas, and that starts with life expectancy. Rural life expectancy is lower than urban and suburban life expectancy, and part of this is because of the opioid epidemic, which has hit rural America very hard. But it was even like this before the opioid epidemic. Urban and suburban life expectancies were growing, and the rural life expectancy was just kind of staying put. And part of that's due to healthcare access. Healthcare access in rural America is oftentimes pretty poor. So, although 1 out of 5 Americans live in rural areas, only 1 out of 10 physicians practice there. There's a big health physician. There's a shortage in rural America, and access to healthcare is impaired by poor access to transportation, poor access to internet connectivity, and a lack of employment, which leads to a lack of health insurance. And rural Americans are even dying from some causes more than suburban and urban areas. Rural Americans are more likely to die from cancer, heart disease, chronic lower respiratory disease, stroke, and accidental injuries compared to their suburban and urban counterparts. And this I believe is due to a lack of healthcare access in many rural areas. Internet access is also a big problem facing rural Americans. So as you can see from this chart here, nearly 6 in 10 rural Americans believe that high-speed internet access is a problem in their area. And comparatively, less than 50% of urban and suburban Americans and less than 40% of suburban Americans feel that internet access is a problem in their area. And additionally, there are 42 million Americans that lack access to a broadband internet connection, which is basically considered a high-speed internet connection in this day, and all 99% of those are going to be located in rural America. The cumulative result of all of these problems is a phenomenon called brain drain. And brain drain is when the skilled minds and talented workers of rural America, they leave for the cities and suburbs, and they leave behind these rural areas and they create packets of poverty from those that aren't highly as educated, aren't highly as trained, and they can't fill all these jobs that are needed in rural America. And so, as I've said previously, brain drain can be solved, and that is the key to revitalizing rural America. But it's going to take all of the branches together, all the branches of government working together. So, I'm going to overview what the three branches of government can do to fix this issue. So, local governments, because of their size, because they just focus on one city, able to offer the most specialized help. Now, one way they could do this is in their economic policy. Local governments, whenever possible, should increase their spending on education because this not only improves the local school districts, but it also studies show that education spending stimulates local economic growth. Furthermore, in a U.S. Department of Agriculture study, it found that rural members who go off to college and then are considering where to go back to settle down in their previous rural areas or to go off into the cities and suburbs, one of the big reasons that they choose to return to rural areas is if there are good school districts. And spending on schools will help improve the school districts, and overall, it'll help retain people in rural communities. Another economic policy thing that will help local governments is to try and offer lower taxes relative to their neighboring communities. Several studies have found the negative associations with high taxes, especially relative to neighboring communities. But offering low taxes has been found to encourage businesses to come and set up in these rural communities, and also incentivizes people to move to your community compared to other communities that might have higher tax rates. Other things that local governments should focus on doing are establishing and maintaining small business organizations. This can be anything like the Main Street organization, which focuses on recruiting businesses to downtown, like in Fayette, the downtown square, and like Rotary, which Rotary will fund some smaller things that aren't really like recreational opportunities that aren't essential to towns, but they're really beneficial for residents to have. Finally, a small town should make sure that they offer developed recreation opportunities. Although this may seem like a small thing, a U.S. Department of Agriculture study has found that consistently people choose a big factor in where people choose to live is what kind of recreation opportunities are available. Like, is there a pool? Are there developed trails and stuff? And developed recreation is it's a really good factor in attracting people to come and live in your rural community. The state government is kind of limited to what it can do because it can't focus on individual communities like local governments can, but it doesn't have the broad reaching power that federal governments have. So it's kind of not able to do much, but a couple fixes that state government could do. So one policy implementation is rural opportunity zones. Kansas has done this. So what rural opportunity zones are basically rural counties, and they're trying to encourage people from out of state to move to these rural communities. And they do this by offering no property tax for out of state people moving in for 5 years. And they also repay some student loans for 5 years. And if you move to these rural Kansas counties, and doing this, they found that there was not a ton of participation, but they did have some participation, and they found a return on investment of what they were spending on $4.50 in economic opportunity for every dollar they spent. Finally, states can also budget more money for education, especially rural education. The facts are clear. Many rural school districts are not getting the funding they need, and a lot of times this is due to the how the state allocates funding. So you allocate funds, it'll help rural education, it'll help these small towns thrive and create economic impact, which will help the state overall. The federal government has the most power, so it's easy to see how they can create the most sweeping change across all rural areas. One way they can do this is by the expansion of loan forgiveness programs. And I'm not talking about Bernie Sanders forgive all student debt. There's a current program. Offers loan forgiveness for teachers, but it's only for teachers that teach in low income districts, and it's for a certain amount of time. And there's not that many other loans forgiven. So I believe that this should be expanded to teachers teaching in all rural areas. Low income covers most rural areas, but it doesn't cover all of them, and these rural areas still need these teachers. And additionally, I think loan forgiveness should be expanded to help the healthcare field as well, because healthcare it's really needed in rural America. There's a healthcare shortage. So if we offer loan forgiveness to healthcare workers that are working in rural areas for a certain amount of time as well, that would really help recruit health physicians to rural areas. Secondly, the federal government needs to expand and promote apprenticeship programs. Research shows that rural areas they have needs that aren't being filled in the trade industry. Now, this can be accomplished by the federal government expanding and promoting apprenticeship programs. Like, for example, college is promoted now. It's like all teachers are advocating you to go to college, but there's many of these high paying jobs in the trade industry and the apprenticeship that you could just have an apprenticeship for that aren't really being advocated. So I'd say many students at even my school don't have an idea of how good an apprenticeship program could be if it's right for you. So the federal government needs to kind of promote it and make it well known to students coming out of high school, and they can do this by offering financial aid to maybe businesses that are offering apprenticeship programs to help them expand it, and offer other resources like launch an ad campaign and create a campaign promoting apprenticeships. This would really help expand the program and meet the needs in rural areas and put rural Americans to work. Next, broadband internet needs to be offered to all these rural Americans. Especially today in a quarantined world, we really need high-speed internet access to keep up with school, to keep up with jobs and work. And when there's, 40, 50 million Americans that are lacking a high-speed broadband internet connection, and that's just where it isn't offered. There's some Americans that, can't afford it. So broadband internet needs to be offered to all. And the federal government can do this by locating funds, and they can also accomplish this by eliminating, there's some policy that's really hindersome that doesn't let broadband providing companies expand to rural areas. So the federal government can take care of this policy that's stifling network build out, and it would encourage these companies to expand to rural areas. Finally, the federal government needs to invest time and money into agriculture and agriculture development. This would really benefit rural areas, obviously, because a lot of people employed in rural areas are in the agriculture field. And trying to develop this new technology can really benefit these farmers. Example of this is drone technology. Technology is really new in the last few years, and now it can be used. It's used in a variety of ways on farms, and it's even helping. Studies have shown that it's even helping farmers save money and be more cost efficient. However, there's been some really restrictive legislation by the Federal Aviation Administration. It strictly regulates drones, and it's kind of made them impossible to use on farms in some cases. So if the federal government can get rid of this legislation and at least make it more technology more accessible to farmers, this would be a good way to help improve the lives of farmers and of rural Americans. And investing in technology like drones have immensely helped these rural Americans. And if you invested developing more technology like that, it's just going to rural Americans are going to get more profitable, and the economy is just going to do better as a whole. So despite everything I've talked about, rural areas still are in many cases they're great. There's some that are doing well, but there are some areas that are really struggling. And if we work on these issues to help fix the education in rural America, to help access with healthcare, to create economic opportunity, we're going to see people come back to rural areas, and we're going to really see rural America start to thrive, and you start to get the respect that they deserve. So this concludes my capstone presentation. Thank you for watching.